Honored to be introducing our latest speaker in our ongoing speaker series here. This is David Firestein. He is the Perot Fellow and Senior Vice President of the East-West Institute, which is really one of the most innovative and influential think tanks and track two dialogue outfits out there. A lot of their best work takes place under the radar, but trust me when I say the world is a better place for them doing their work. David came to East-West from a very distinguished career with the U.S. State Department, where, among other things, he developed fluency in Chinese and Russian, two very difficult languages. I know from having tried and failed to learn either of them myself. But most importantly, for our purposes, he is a native Austinite and an alum of the LBJ School. So, LBJ students out there, this could be your future. So please join me in giving a warm LBJ and Clements Center welcome to David Firestein.
Will, thank you so much for the very gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. I often have the opportunity to come back to my beloved hometown of Austin, Texas, and to my beloved alma mater, the LBJ School and UT, to do talks. But this is the first time I've had the honor and the opportunity to speak under the auspices of the Clements Center. I'm very grateful, Will, to you and to the Center for this opportunity, and to all of you for sharing your lunch hour with me. It's a real privilege to be here. The topic, which is the X factor, exceptionalism in major international conflict in the 21st century, is one that I have been looking at over the last couple of years, and really most intensively since the beginning of last year. And it's a topic that I was drawn to for a number of reasons. I want to say a little bit about how I got into it. But I think the basic concept is that as all of us look around at the world and see what's happening in the world today, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Southeastern Europe, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's in East Asia, whether it's North Korea, cross-strait relations, South Asia, we see a world that appears to be, at least at times, appears to be in turmoil. And so the question basically that I pose in this presentation is there a common theme or a common strand that brings together what is happening and helps explain what is happening in the world today and what isn't happening in the world. And I think that this is in kind of a long line of attempts that have been made by very distinguished scholars, which I'll talk about briefly in a second, to try to make sense of the world and to try to answer the basic question, and the question that's at the core of my presentation, which is, why does conflict happen? Why does major international conflict specifically happen? Now, as you note in my title, the X factor, exceptionalism and major international conflict in the 21st century, there's this term exceptionalism. And so I want to say a few words about how I got into the notion of exceptionalism, because I think that tells you something about my mindset and kind of the premise that forms the undergirding to the research that I've done and the probing that I've done in this area. I was giving a talk at Michigan State University a couple of years ago, and I, as always, speak from handwritten notes, and the reason my talks are typically very extemporaneous is because, of course, I can't read any of the notes that I've written, and so I have to kind of think on my feet and be extemporaneous. And one of the things that I said that wasn't in my notes, I checked after the fact, is that I was speaking about U.S.-Iran relations. That's another area that I work a little bit on. It's not my principal area of expertise, but I do work a little on U.S.-Iran relations. I also work, as Will kindly noted, a lot on U.S.-China, U.S.-Russia. Those have been my principal focal points in my career. But speaking about U.S.-Iran, one of the points that I made that had not been in my notes is that one of the reasons that this particular bilateral relationship is fraught with challenge, difficulty, tensions, mistrust, is that the U.S. and Iran are both nations that regard themselves as exceptional nations. Both of them. And any time, I sort of theorized on my feet, I said any time you have two nations that are dealing with each other from a position of self-regarded or self-defined exceptionalism, the relationship gets that much more complicated by probably orders of magnitude than would be the case if you were dealing with two nations, neither of which defined itself as exceptional. And I'll talk a lot more about what I mean by exceptionalism in that construct. But when I said that about U.S.-Iran, it occurred to me even in the moment that that's what also makes U.S.-China relations so complicated. It's what makes U.S.-Russia relations complicated. And frankly, it's what makes a number of bilateral relationships in the world today as complicated and fraught with tension as they are, even bilateral relationships that don't involve the United States, such as, for example, China, North Korea, Japan, and a whole list of different bilateral relationships. So that's what got me into this idea of exceptionalism. And then I started thinking, how does that apply to the world that we see today? And so what I want to do in this talk is to lay out a few different points and to try to go for maybe about 45 minutes or so, and hopefully leave enough time. I see there's a clock here, which I will try to use to keep myself honest, because I hope we'll leave enough time for some discussion, some interaction, for your questions and comments, agreements or disagreements with any of my ideas. And I know we have until about 1:30, so I want to be respectful of your time. In my appointed time, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the theories of conflict that have sort of paved the way for what I regard as my own new contribution to the theories of conflict. I want to talk about the common elements of major international conflict. I then want to focus specifically on the issue of exceptionalism, which of course is in the title and is really kind of the heart and soul of my presentation, and I'll lay that out in more detail. Then perhaps make a brief reference to a few cases of real and potential major international conflict in the world today to sort of test some of my ideas, at least very briefly, against some of the real world situations that we see today. And then talk about the implications of this X factor theory for policymakers before offering a few concluding thoughts, and then again hopefully going to Q&A. So that's kind of the agenda for what I'd like to do over the next roughly half hour, 35 minutes or so. So the first thing I want to talk about is the previous theories of conflict that we have seen, efforts that we have seen made to try to explain why conflict happens, or in some cases why it won't happen, let's say, in the future. And one of the first theories that I think gained major notoriety in the modern era in the last quarter century or so was, of course, the work of Francis Fukuyama and the notion of the end of history. So I won't delve into this except to say that obviously Mr. Fukuyama's work is well known. He posited that at the end of the Cold War, he was writing in 1989 and 90, that with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, or the dissolution in any case at that moment in time of the Warsaw Pact, and essentially the end of the Cold War, that basically the central issue in world history that had been, or at least modern world history, that had been the driver of so much conflict and potential conflict had now dissipated. With the end of the ideological competition, to paraphrase or summarize his work, the idea was that there shouldn't be any major international conflicts of a world scale going beyond the Cold War era. And thus history had come to its logical conclusion. Democracy and the marketplace had become the dominant ideas, and therefore the world was going to become a post-historic place that was more or less at peace. Now, I won't spend a lot of time laying out all these years later, and in fact even just a few years after the theory was published and became very popular, to note that things didn't play out the way that Fukuyama thought they would. And in fact, just a few years later, he himself came out and noted that there were some deficiencies that he had found in his own theory, and wrote about that as well. And I certainly respect both the work that he did, but also the follow-up work to sort of say, here's what's happening in the world today. But the bottom line is, I think all of us can agree, I think Mr. Fukuyama would agree, history did not come to an end circa 89 or 90, or at the end of 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and that's very clear to see. One could point to a lot of examples, but 9/11 itself, just as one data point among others, to say nothing of conflict in southeastern Europe and other places around the world, North Korea and so on. There are a lot of examples of history raging on today. So that was Fukuyama. A few years later, Samuel Huntington wrote about the clash of civilizations, and to some degree it was a response to the writings of Fukuyama. And he basically, that is Professor Huntington basically said that, okay, it appears that the notion that history has ended is no longer valid. It seems to be continuing. Okay, let's grant that. So what other theory might there be to explain why conflict is in fact continuing in the world? And so he offered, Professor Huntington offered the notion of the clash of civilizations, basically saying that there were about 8 geo-civilizational blocks in the world, including America plus Western Europe, the Orthodox world led by Russia, China, Confucian East Asia, Africa, the Islamic world, and so on. And that he posited that, as the title of his seminal work makes clear, that the conflicts in the world would play out along geo-civilizational fault lines. That was his basic argument. And over time, again, not to delve too much into this because I lay this out as backdrop for the work that I want to talk about today, but to make what I think is now an obvious point, is that there were a couple of significant problems with that theory that materialized over time. And the two major problems, and these are my words, but I think others probably have made similar points in their critiques of Mr. Huntington's work, that number one, most civilizational blocks are at peace with each other. So the notion that if geo-civilizational blocks are the sort of common denominator of conflict, then one would expect that geo-civilizational blocks would frequently be in conflict as blocks with each other. But that is not the case. And in fact, there is almost no conflict in the world today that is explained by the geo-civilizational blocks that Dr. Huntington laid out in his work. For example, the United States and North America is not in conflict with South America, we're not in conflict with Europe, we're not in conflict with East Asia, we're not in conflict with any places. We'll come back to the Islamic world in a minute. But most of these examples don't exist, and therefore that leads to, I think, a legitimate critique of the argument. But perhaps the more damning critique is the fact that within one of those blocks, we see conflicts raging, and here I am speaking about the Islamic world, and about Sunni and Shia Islam in particular, that was not anticipated in the theory espoused by Dr. Huntington in the Clash of Civilizations. In other words, what we see is some of the most significant and tragic and deadliest conflict on the earth today. In fact, the most significant and the deadliest conflict occurs wholly contained within the Islamic world. That should not be happening according to this theory. And you need to look no further than Iran, Iraq, than Sunni, Shia, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, civil conflict in Syria, civil conflict in Afghanistan, and so on. And let me also note that that most violence in the world today, and I can talk a little bit more about this at the appropriate moment or in our discussion, most violence in the world today, that is when people lose their lives to an act of violence, i.e. warfare, terrorism, when someone is trying to kill you and they succeed at killing a person, the numbers show, and they're on the record, they're in the public domain, that the overwhelming majority of deaths that occur in the world are folks from the Islamic faith killing folks from the Islamic faith. That is statistically a fact. In fact, it's the overwhelming majority of cases of death owing to conflict in the world today. So that in itself, I think, makes it clear that the notion that there is a clash of civilizations, I think, is problematic. Let me just make a couple of other points briefly before turning to my notion of the common denominators of conflict, exceptionalism, and so on. And that is, there was another effort that was less well known than that of Fukuyama and that of Huntington, and it was something called the Pentagon's New Map. That was the name of a book by a gentleman named Thomas Barnett, writing circa 2005, 2006. It was a very interesting piece of work. It did not get the worldwide acclaim that the other books and work did. But basically, Dr. Barnett said that, in his judgment, having looked at the failure to explain conflict of the Fukuyama theory and the Huntington theory, here was his take. And his take was that conflict in the world today is really about one thing: connectedness and the absence of connectedness. And his basic theory was that the countries of the world that are connected are going to have to be dealing with problems emanating from the countries and non-state actors of the world that are unconnected to the world. and it's that connectedness fault line, again, this is his theory, that is really the fault line for conflict in the world today. So that by connectedness, what Barnett is referring to is countries or entities that are either connected to or disconnected from world trade, globalization writ large, labor flows, migration, information flows, investment flows, all of the things that sort of, if you will, make world. If you're not connected to those things, in Barnett's theory, you're the problem. And it's those that are connected to the world, to trade, to the WTO, to investment, to labor migration, to perhaps very importantly, most importantly maybe, information, the internet, and so on. It's those folks that are going to have to mind the gap and deal with. So that folks would have to be minding the gap, and that this conflict would be around this fault line. Now, the problem with that is a couple of things. Number one, that a lot of the people and entities and states that were not connected 10 years ago are connected today. Let me give you one example. ISIS is a force in the world that didn't exist as such and was not named as such 10 years ago, 5 years ago. It was not talked about. It was not something that was, there may have been precursors, but it was not the force in the headline that it is today. They are, in some ways, at least in an information sense, anything but disconnected, and in fact they use the internet and YouTube and global communications in some instances of surprising levels of sophistication to publicize their horrific, barbaric, and savage acts of terrorism. So the notion that they are unconnected, I think, is something that has changed in the world since Barnett wrote. And secondly, what Barnett's theory doesn't explain is the conflict that takes place within the connected world, which is still there. So when Russia and Ukraine ended up in conflict, starting in 2014 and carrying at a lower level of intensity into the present day, those are countries that by any definition, including Barnett's, are connected. When there are tensions between the mainland, the Chinese mainland, and Taiwan, those are two places that are connected. When there are tensions between North Korea, that's an unconnected place, but there is often tensions associated with the diplomacy associated with North Korea, and those tensions play out among countries and players and the other members of the five-party talks that are connected. So there are, I think, problem spots in that theory. The final thing I would mention that I actually have not mentioned before in this talk is a topic and a construct that is of some salience to the issue of China. And that is a theory that the Chinese like to talk about. And I've never mentioned it in this talk before, but it's something that does occur to me. And I want to kind of put it out there into the ether as well. It's the notion that of this so-called Thucydides trap, which is not a Chinese invention, but they are popularizing the notion that, and what the Thucydides trap refers to is the idea that there will always be conflict between a major rising power and a major established power. And this was something that the historian Thucydides sort of found in his work long, long ago. And it's now manifested as the sort of rising power, established power idea that the Chinese themselves have latched onto as part of their national ideology at the moment of what they call a new type, generating a new type of major power relations. And it's basically the idea that if you have a rising country like a China, that it will tend to go to war with an established dominant power like the United States. I use those as two examples, but the theory goes more broadly than that. The hole that I would poke into that theory is that it's a great theory, but it stopped explaining anything starting in 1945. The reason, and by the way, there have been scholars that have studied and written about and published charts, analysis including charts that show when the last instances, chronologically, of the Thucydides trap occurred. All of those charts end in 1945. I don't recall that the authors say why, but I think I can tell you why. And I believe this is an original insight, but it may not be. I'm not aware that others have made this point. But the problem with the Thucydides trap as an explanation for conflict is that it ignores the existence of nuclear weapons. Since the nuclear weapons era began in 1945, there has not been a case of the Thucydides trap playing out. And the reason is, and these are my words and my working theorem, is that if you're not a nuclear power, you're probably not a major power in the global conflict sense of the term. And if you are a nuclear power, then you probably already are established and nobody is going to challenge you, because challenging a nuclear power is generally not a good idea. So the notion of the advent of nuclear weapons in 1945, used only twice, but nevertheless coloring the geopolitical and sort of geo-conflict landscape, basically renders obsolete the notion of a rising power challenging an established power. Because the established powers today are armed with weapons that can incinerate any rising power, unless the rising power itself is a nuclear power, in which case you have the construct of deterrence. So I would argue that that theory, and I don't know that others have made this point, I think that theory is obsolete already because nuclear weapons rendered that theory obsolete. Now with that, let me come to my topic. The point that I'm trying to make is that there have been many attempts to try to explain conflict and none of them seem to still apply. That's the research question that I'm trying to ask, and that's the research question that I'm trying to answer. Why do conflicts happen? If it's not because of ideology, if it's not because of civilization, if it's not because of connectedness, if it's not because of inherent differences in the growth trajectories of powers as such, then why is it? And I postulate that there are a number of factors that collectively, ultimately can and often do lead to global conflict, major international conflict. And that absent one of these factors, which I will describe now, you generally don't see global conflict. So you have to have all of them, and I'll go through that list now, to actually have the conditions that are necessary and right for major international conflict. Now let me make 2 points about methodology here before I get into this in earnest. And the points are as follows. That number one, when I talk about major international conflict, it raises, first of all, a question. What is major international conflict? What's the definition that I'm using? And I've thought about this. There are standard definitions out in the academic world and the policy world for what constitutes major conflict. Usually it's defined in terms of number of deaths generated from combat, from armed violence. Different definitions are out there. Some define it as major international conflict as a conflict between at least one state and one non-state, or two state entities, but in other words, conflict that is not wholly contained within the boundaries of one country. I'll come back to that in a minute. So two parties that cross an international boundary, and then some number of deaths. Some people use 1,000, some use 5,000. I've never seen anyone use more than 10,000 deaths generated per year as a metric for major conflict. So, in other words, the academia and those who look at these issues seem to agree when you get to 10,000, you're for sure in major conflict. There are debates about whether 1,000 or 5,000 constitute that. So whatever number that you use, it's on that order of magnitude. That's what we're talking about. In a little while, I'll come back to why the number actually doesn't matter. But let me come back to that point in a minute. And having foreshadowed it, let me just make the point. The reason that the matter, whether it's 1, 5, or 10,000, doesn't matter in an analytical sense. Obviously, it matters in a human tragedy sense, of course. In an analytical sense is because there is no current international conflict that is generating any of those numbers of deaths. As counterintuitive as that may sound, given what's happening in the world, no current international conflict is generating that many deaths year over year. Most deaths that occur, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, it's been well documented by many think tanks, and in Sweden there's an entity that looks at conflict and peace issues, and there are many others. Most of them are Iraqis killing Iraqis in Iraq. Most of them are Afghans killing Afghans in Afghanistan. Most of them are Syrians killing Syrians in Syria, and the list goes on. Same for Boko Haram in Nigeria, same for Yemen, and same for Pakistan. And in fact, the countries I just named collectively account for about 85% of all deaths in the world owing to violence. And they're internecine, they're civil, they are meaning contained within the boundaries of one nation, and they're not international by definition. So when you factor that out, it doesn't mean it's not a horrific human tragedy, but what it means is it's a domestically contained human tragedy. When you factor that out, what you quickly realize is, from an international conflict standpoint today, as counter-conventional as this might actually sound, it is a time of relative peace in the world today from the standpoint of major international conflict as I've defined it. Now, with that being said, let me make one other point. The way that I came into this topic is to sort of say what's going on in the world today, and where there are conflicts and where there are potential conflicts, and more often the case, what are the common denominators that those conflicts have? And that's what I want to talk about, because I think there are 5 discernible common denominators, and that's what I want to talk about as a way of getting into the topic of exceptionalism. So in this order, I would lay out the 5 common denominators of conflict. And I don't think anyone has done this before in this way. At least I'm not aware of it. So the first thing I think you have to have what I call major international conflict. And again, I'm not looking as a research matter at domestic conflict. I state that at the outset. I'm looking at major international. With that said, the first thing you have to have is the involvement of at least one state. You have to have, in my theory, this is my theory, I'm not speaking about facts, but about a theory that I'm putting forth on the basis of my assessment of what's happening in the world. You have to have a state. You have to have at least one state. What does that mean? That means that if you have 2 non-state entities, you probably don't have a major international conflict. That it takes the scalability that only a state has, the ability to scale conflict, the ability to escalate conflict, the ability to generate massive scale death that generally only a state has in order to have major international conflict. Now, we look at ISIS, we look at terrorism, and as a general rule, with very few exceptions, and there have been certainly one massive exception on 9/11, but with very few exceptions, the ability of a terrorist entity to take massive life is very limited. No one reads about, with the exception of 9/11, instances, and it's been documented, and I've looked at the data, where a terrorist entity takes thousands or tens of thousands of lives. More often it's 16, 18, 27, 70, a couple of hundred, 3, 1. Every human life lost is a tragedy, but the scale is not the same as what a state can do. They don't operate that way. So you have to have at least one state involved to create major international conflict. And needless to say, you have to be dealing with some entity outside of your state, otherwise it becomes civil strife. So you could have a state and a state, or you could have a state and a non-state entity, as long as there's one international boundary. The second thing that you have to have is the absence of a democracy in at least one of the players. Now this goes back to the well-worn notion that's been around for a long time, which is summarized by the phrase, democracies don't fight each other. And what you'll find if you look around the world today is that basically that's true. Basically that's true. There can be very rare exceptions. I could think of one perhaps where arguably you have, quote, democracies engaging in some conflict with each other in which life is lost, but even there the scale is relatively minor. But generally democracies don't fight democracy. So to have a major international conflict, the second thing you need is at least one of the entities, whether the state or the non-state entity, and you have to have at least one state, one of those has to be a non-democracy. And I can explain why, but in essence, it's because when you have democratic accountability, noting that there indeed are exceptions to this, but as a general concept, you have one more check on the propensity of leaders, not a foolproof system, as we know, but one more check on leaders who might have a propensity to send sons and daughters into war. So it tends to make it harder to go to war for most countries. One could argue the U.S. is a bit of an exception, perhaps, to this particular point, because we are a democracy and we do engage in warfare around the world at different times. That being said, as a general construct, I think the point is well taken. The third thing that you have to have in the mix to have a major international conflict is a non-nuclear power. The reason for that is very simple. If you have two nuclear powers, they're not going to go to war with each other because of something called nuclear deterrence. And indeed, I base that theory, that is forward-looking theory, on the past 71 years of history, because no nuclear nations have gone to war with each other, period. We used the atomic bomb twice in Japan, and after that, no one has ever used it again, and no two nuclear powers have ever been in direct warfare with each other. There have been disagreements, there have been conflicts, there have been, sometimes airplanes have bumped into each other in the sky, but we are not fighting, nuclear powers do not fight wars against each other. That is probably even more unqualifiedly true than the notion of democracies not fighting. So a non-nuclear power has to be in the mix. There are 9 nuclear powers in the world today. The permanent members of the Security Council, and then Israel, the one declared, North Korea, and India and Pakistan. And interesting question is what happens down the line with certain other countries, Iran and others that may want to go down that road, or may develop a capability that allows them to go down that road or look down that road, but right now there are 9. So that's the nuclear element of my theory. Now the fourth point, having talked about you need a state, you need a non-democracy, you need a non-nuclear power as one of the parties to the conflict. The fourth point is exceptionalism. My argument, my central argument is that global, major international conflict will tend to only happen if there is at least one nation involved that only if there is at least one nation involved that self-defines as exceptional. That if you have two countries that dealing with each other and disagreeing, and neither of them regard themselves as exceptional, and I'll talk a lot more about this in a second, then you're not going to have conflict. If you have at least one, or perhaps both countries, who are self-defining themselves, self-defining, not me saying it, they're self-defining themselves at some level as exceptional, then you have a much higher propensity for the possibility of conflict. And I'll explain why I believe that in a little bit. So exceptionalism is the fourth piece of the puzzle. And the fifth piece, and arguably worth a presentation, I think, unto itself, is the issue of interests. All of us that study and work in international relations understand that national interests are kind of the currency of international relations. But let me make a couple of points here. In my research, in my assessment of what is happening in the world and what's not happening in terms of conflict in the world, the conclusion I've come to is that there are actually only 2 types of interests that countries today, I'm not talking about 500 years ago or 100 years ago, today in the 21st century, in 2016, there are only 2 kinds of interests that spark conflict among countries. 2 very specific ones. And one is called what I term existential interests. That's pretty self-evident, and that's obvious. If you believe you are about to be terminated as a nation or as a regime in charge of a nation, usually as an undemocratically elected regime, i.e. a dictatorship, and if you believe that you are looking at the possibility of being terminated as a regime or as a nation, you will fight to preserve yourself, to preserve your existence. That's existential. But there's another type of interest that countries do fight over. And that is what I call, and I think I've coined this term, identity interests. And this, what I mean by identity interests is a kind of national interest in which the country is saying that this interest goes to what makes me who I am as a country. And whether or not it matters in an economic sense, whether or not it matters in a political sense, whether or not it matters in terms of the day-to-day lives of average people, I would not be who I am as a nation or as a non-state entity or as a regime if this interest is challenged in the future. That's an identity interest. It goes to the core sense of a nation or its leadership's sense for who that nation is as a nation among nations. I can give you an example of this, and maybe I'll do that, and I'll try to make one other point about interest before going to exceptionalism. If you look at the case, just for example, of China, mainland China, and Taiwan. Mainland Chinese officials, from the president right down the line, have consistently said, and will always say, that Taiwan is a core interest of the People's Republic of China, and essentially that China would in fact fight a war, and would fight World War III in order to keep Taiwan in the fold. They've said that. Now, I take that at face value, but here's my point. Taiwan does not contribute in a direct statistical sense to the GDP figure of the People's Republic of China. It doesn't contribute to the population figure of the People's Republic of China. It is not controlled in any way by the People's Republic of China. It has its own flag, it has its own government, it has its own president, it has its own currency, it has its own military forces. And if, speaking in a hypothetical sense to make it a conceptual point, if Taiwan were to simply float off into the ocean, I'm not advocating that, but if it were to float off into the ocean and disappear somehow, China would not be any different for it in any statistically measurable way. Because none of the numbers associated with Taiwan are counted in the Chinese statistics. However, at a psychic level, that is an unacceptable outcome to the Chinese, to the point where they would in fact fight World War III to prevent it from happening. That is an identity interest. It's not about dollars and cents, it's not about trade, it's not about people, it's not even about people. Let's point that out. It's about a psychic sense of who China thinks itself to be. That's what we're talking about. Look at Russia, Ukraine. You see the same thing. The notion of Crimea. Where should it belong? It should belong in the Russian view to Russia, as it de facto does today. De facto. With almost no countries recognizing it, but de facto it does belong to Russia. As President Putin has said, Crimea has reached its final port. That had nothing to do with anything relating to GDP, trade, wealth, health, the protection of people. It was about a psychic sense that this place belonged as part of Russia. These are the things that drive countries and non-state entities to violent action. And only these things. Now, some may say, well, what about if your people are dying? And I would say, countries generally don't fight over something so trivial as that. Mostly, when people in your country are dying by the thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands, or millions, it's because of what the government is doing to its own people, not because of what some country on the outside is doing to those people. And that's not, and we can cite case after case after case after case, that's not generally today why countries fight. Let me make one other general point about interest, and then I'll segue to the exceptionalism piece. And I'll condense a little bit to still preserve time for Q&A. And that is that I want to make a point that I first made extemporaneously at the U.S. Army War College. It wasn't in my notes, but it came to me in that moment, and I think there's something to it. And that is that interests are not inherent. National interests are not inherent. They are not objective. They are not empirical. They are not scientific. They are constructed. National interests are constructed. They are human constructions. They are subjective. They change. They can change overnight, and they do every day. So the notion that there is some core national interest that is unchanging is actually a fallacy. I could cite many examples, but let me go back to China again just as one case in point. By no means the only one. The United States in the 1970s deemed that it was in our national interest to have zero contact with the People's Republic of China. Right up until the second that we deemed it was in our interest to have substantial contact with the People's Republic of China. And then, not long after, full normalization. What changed? Not much, except psychically and subjectively and in our own sense of values and our own sense of priorities, something in President Nixon and Henry Kissinger and his team and so forth changed, and they reframed the issue. They came to a different viewpoint, and they decided that the diametrically opposite thing to do was the right thing to do relative to what we had been doing. When Iraq lobbed Scud missiles into Israel in the first Gulf War in 1990, one after the other into heavy population centers, killing people. Thank God, not many, very limited casualties, but nevertheless, tragically and horrifically, people died. Israel didn't do a single thing, not one thing. They didn't fire a slingshot in response. Now, there were specific reasons they didn't do that. Anyone would say that it is in a country's national interest that when you are attacked, as was unquestionably the case in this case, you are well within your rights, you're within the UN Charter, you're within moral authority to strike back. They didn't do it because their construction of their interests was such that they deemed that they could advance their interests by not even firing a spitball gun in response to these Scud attacks. That's an example of the subjectivity of interest. I think we should keep that in mind, and if you accept that idea, then I think you can quickly come to the notion that interests relating to identity actually matter a lot more than interests relating to economics, oil, or even the death of your own people. Now, let me talk a little bit about exceptionalism and just say a few words. Basically, what do I mean by exceptionalism? Obviously, it's a well-known term and much studied, etc. But let me just give you my quick working definition of what I mean. And that is, exceptionalism means, when we're talking about a state or non-state actor, that you believe that the rules that apply to others do not always apply to you. That's what it means. That's all it means. It means that the rules that apply to others do not always apply to you. You're special. You get to go to the front of the line and cut in line and go in that popular New York City club, metaphorically speaking. You get to do what you want to do because you want to do it. Whether or not it's allowed, whether or not it's in accordance with the United Nations Charter, whether it's in accordance with established international law, you're special and you have the right to do it. That's what exceptionalism really is, that you are an exception to the rule. That's what the term means. There are different academic definitions, but that's a pretty good capturing, I think, of the essence of what exceptionalism is in terms of international relations. The point that I want to make is that in my research, I have laid out the idea that there are three types, principally, three types of exceptionalism in the world today. And that to understand why certain countries do what they do, and why they don't do what they don't do, to understand the motivations and the impetus for national action and conflict, you have to understand the concept of exceptionalism, but you have to understand which exceptionalism you're talking about. And so let me lay out my three-point framework for exceptionalism. And I derived this myself. If it's redundant to the work of others, I'm not aware of that. I don't think it is. But in fact, it was literally on an airplane ride to Austin that I jotted it down on, actually, on this very piece of indecipherable paper. The paper's not indecipherable, the words on it are. And that is the idea that these three types of exceptionalism are the following. Number one, these are my terms, divine exceptionalism. And number two, there is what I call essential or civilizational exceptionalism. And then there's the third type, and I'll say a few words about each, that I call excluded exceptionalism. And those are my three categories. I think I've coined those terms in this context, I believe, at least as is said. Now, what do I mean by divine exceptionalism? I mean that a country that believes that it is divinely exceptional, whether or not it uses that phrase to describe itself, but if it believes that it is divinely exceptional, it believes that it is doing God's will in the world. It believes that God is on its side. It believes that the breath of God is in its sails, as I put it on a previous talk. And you believe that you're therefore right, because after all, God can't be wrong. So those that believe that they are divinely exceptional feel that they have a very special dispensation in the world. Special rules apply to them, special exceptions apply to them, that they are doing God's work, that they are on the right side in a moral sense of whatever issue they're dealing with. And that informs and colors their view of the entire world. What countries would I put in this category? The United States would be the very first one I would mention. Rightly or wrongly, I'm not making a judgment here. The point that I'm making is I don't think there's any question that we as a nation think that we are doing God's work in the world. I don't think anyone would dispute that. Presidents of both parties, leaders of both parties would always, invariably, as a matter of deep national tradition, invoke God's blessings on our nation and frame what we do in deeply moral, religious, Judeo-Christian, and deistic terms, theistic terms. We talk about God. We talk about angels in speeches by presidents. We talk about our mission in the world. And we think of ourselves in those terms, no question about it. And it's bipartisan. It's in the fabric of our national DNA in a political and international relations sense. What other entities out there think of themselves as divinely exceptional? ISIS. And most of these radical Islamic terrorists or radical Islamist terrorists or whatever specific term one wants to use, the people who, in their own words and in their own judgment, in the name of Islam, in their own words, say that they're doing what they do and they're killing who they're killing for that purpose. They, by definition, believe that they're doing it in the name of, quote, Allah. So they're in that camp. Iran is also in this camp. Iran is a theocracy by definition. The formal name of the nation is the Islamic Republic of Iran. So at least you've got those three that are out there. One, I think, could debate whether Israel is in that category because it is a very special place. I think it's a lot less, and I don't mean this with any judgmentalism. If you listen to Israeli speakers, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and others, they invoke God a lot less than American leaders do as a rhetorical matter. But it is a special place. It is, quote, the Jewish homeland. So there is a connection with a religion in some sense, etc. So arguably Israel might be in there, although I would put them much lower in the intensivity level of this divine sense of exceptionalism than even the United States or the others that I mentioned. That's divine. Let me say a little bit about civilizational and essential exceptionalism. This is where a country believes that by virtue of the superiority of its culture, that it is superior, that it is special, and that the rules that apply to others do not apply to it. I think as soon as I say those words, some of us in this room can have a good sense for the kind of countries that I'm talking about. China would be right toward the top of the list. Russia would very much be right up there in that list as well. I would also put Iran in this list. Note that I mentioned them twice, and I think countries can self-define as exceptional in more than one regard. And I don't think there's exclusivity from one list to the next. I think Iran believes it's divinely exceptional. It calls itself an Islamic state. That means it's a theocracy by definition. It also believes it has an enormously important and valuable culture, etc., but some of these others that I've mentioned. So that's there. I would also put Japan in this category. And arguably you could put the United States, perhaps Israel, and maybe even North Korea, which I'll come back to, on the strength of its Koreanness, not on the strength of other facets of North Korea, as potentially countries that self-regard as essentially or civilizationally exceptional. And this means that countries feel they can do things that others can't because they're special. That's what civilizational or essential meaning the essence of the country is such that I have rights and privileges that others don't. The third one is a very interesting category. It's what I call excluded exceptionalism. And excluded exceptionalism basically is a kind of exceptionalism that is imposed on you by others. It is the exceptionalism that is felt by a country or entity that has been cast out of the community of nations, cast out of civilized society, forced to sit at the kids' table, not the adults' table, forced to be on the outside in the snow looking in at the warm Christmas dinner and not being at the table. These are, if you will, the rogues of the world as defined by pretty much the world. So the obvious folks in this category are North Korea, which is, I think, the most, obviously, single most isolated state in the world. But I would also put a couple of others in there in the excluded category that might not be intuitive, but you'll see what I mean. One is the Palestinian Authority. It's not a nation as recognized by most nations, but it is an entity. It is not a UN member per se as a state, although that's an ongoing discussion. But it is, and usually states don't have the word authority in their name. But so it is an authority, it's an entity, it is essentially in certain respects tantamount to a state. But they're on the outside looking in terms of the world system. They don't have representation, they feel excluded. They are excluded. And I'm not judging that, but it's true that they are excluded. And so they're in that category as well. But I'll put one more in there that may surprise folks, and that's Taiwan. Taiwan is excluded. Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations. It cannot be a member of the United Nations. It is not a member of most UN entities, UN-related entities. It is not called a state by approximately 180 countries of the world. That is, the overwhelming majority of nations in the world do not refer to Taiwan as a state because they have relations with the mainland, and it's not, you can't recognize both the states. So it's sort of on the outside looking in. And what becomes clear as I talk about the states or non-state entities that populate these different categories of exceptionalism is that I'm not making a moral judgment about anybody for purposes of this categorization. Obviously, I make moral judgments about a lot of things, but not for purposes here. What I'm saying is you can be a good guy, quote unquote, or a bad guy and be divinely exceptional or essentially or civilizationally exceptional or even excluded. That one category doesn't have a higher moral value than the other. And that's the kind of entities that are out there. So if you take that list and put it together, then what you see is what I call my top 10 exceptional nations or entities in the world. Entities meaning, in some cases, non-state actors. You have the United States, Russia, China, Iran, Israel, Japan, North Korea, Taiwan, Palestinian Authority, and radical Islamic terrorism or Islamist terrorism writ large, i.e. ISIS, i.e. the Taliban, i.e. Al-Qaeda, and the other affiliated groups. That's basically the top 10 exceptional, self-definingly exceptional entities in the world today. Also on my list of sort of near exceptional, I would put Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and maybe not India and Pakistan, and I think Cuba, for a lot of its history, sort of self-identified as exceptional in certain ways, but with normalization with the United States, I think that's evolving. But those countries, I think, don't make my top 10 list. Here's my point. And then I'll be brief on the last couple of parts here. That my thesis is that all conflict in the world going forward, all major international conflict in the world going forward from today, will involve at least one of those 10 places. My theory, I'm looking at the future, so we can't yet judge this to be accurate or inaccurate. My theory is that there will not be a major international conflict in the world that doesn't involve one of those 10, period. Now, when you factor in that some of those are treaty allies with each other, for example, the United States and Japan, the United States and Israel, and Taiwan is not an ally of the United States, but is on extremely friendly terms with our nation, and so forth and so on. If you literally did an XY axis and put the names of the 10 countries across each axis and X'd out the conflicts that are never going to happen, or at least in the foreseeable future, at least I would argue are not going to happen. The U.S. is not going to fight a war against Israel. Israel's not going to fight a war against Japan. You can take a bunch of them off the table right at the outset. And what you're left with is a surprisingly small number of places where everything can hit the fan. And it's actually a knowable, according to this theory, which may be right, may be wrong, but according to this theory, it is a finite universe. It is a knowable number. We could list them on this whiteboard of the possible realistic conflicts that occur if this theory is accurate. So all of a sudden the world becomes a place that it's much easier to make sense of. Let me make a couple of other quick points about this notion of exceptionalism. Note that East and West, if you will, or the sort of the West and the rest, if you want to look at it from that prism, are basically evenly divided. So you've got the US, but you've also got Russia, you've got China, you've got Iran, you've also got Japan and Israel on the sort of west side and others. Bottom line, it's a diverse group. It doesn't lean one way or the other. Notice that 5 of the 10 are nuclear powers. But also notice that 4 of the nuclear powers of the world are not in this list. Namely, France, Great Britain, and India and Pakistan, unless you go out to 15 and bring them in, as I noted earlier. Notice that all but one of these entities are in Asia, if you grant that Russia is, by geography, 2/3 Asian and only 1/3 European. The only country that is not an Asian entity or country is the United States, and obviously we are an Asia-Pacific power. Suggests that the next big major international conflict in the world is going to be in Asia. And not in Europe, not South America, not North America, not Africa, and so on. And notice also that the lists don't have to be exclusive. You can be in more than one category. And that only one of these types of exceptionalism is really malleable in the short term. Because most of these are woven into the tapestry of the national psyche, or the non-state identity psyche of the entity in question. In other words, if you think you're civilizationally exceptional, like China, Russia, Iran, arguably Japan, or Japan I would say, arguably the US, Israel, and others, nothing anyone can ever say will ever disabuse you or convince you otherwise. Let's just accept that that will always, for the long term, be a part of your national security sense of identity in your psyche. By the same token, if you think that God has blessed you, just as objectively it is true that God has blessed the state of Texas, as is noted in the song that Governor Perry danced to last night on Dancing with the Stars, I might add, God bless Texas, leaving scientific fact aside for the moment. If you think that God has blessed you, nothing that nobody says is going to convince you otherwise, as we know in Texas. So that's not going to change. The only thing that can change is what is a sense of excluded exceptionalism, because it's not generally, arguably with one exception, but it's not generally you that excluded yourself. It was imposed upon you by others, and what they take away, they can give back. Iran was enormously excluded and isolated until it wasn't, around the nuclear deal. Cuba was extremely isolated relative at least to the United States and in some ways the global economy until, guess what, we normalized relations. So that is malleable. That's the one piece of this that can actually change. And I think that this notion of exceptionalism is really a central element of this thesis that I would offer. Now let me say a few words briefly about why, and I'll condense this part considerably. But it's important to say, why do I think exceptionalism is the active ingredient in this theory? So why do I then focus on the, quote, the X factor, as I've termed it, the EX factor, standing for exceptionalism? And that's for the following reasons. I'll try to be brief here. Number one, if you think that the rules, and this is why does exceptionalism contribute to conflict? Why is exceptionalism the active ingredient? Number one, if you think that the rules don't apply to me, if you think the rules don't apply to you, then the rules that prevent conflict also don't apply to you. So if you think, well, gee, I don't have to obey the rules, then it stands to reason that you don't feel compelled to obey the rules that prohibit going into armed conflict. So that's an obvious point, but it needs to be made. Number two, so countries that define themselves as exceptional tend to regard themselves as being righteous and right on the issues. And when you think you're right, whether it's because of divine inspiration, whether it's because of, let's say, civilizational considerations, then you will tend to go into conflict knowing that you're on the right side, believing, that is to say, that you're on the right side. So if you're exceptional, you think you're right, if you're certain of your rectitude, including your moral rectitude, you're more likely to go into conflict. Number three, exceptionalism distorts national leadership's perceptions of world opinion, in my judgment. People that are at the top in decision-making positions, leaders, presidents, prime ministers, etc., foreign ministers, of nations that self-define as exceptional, tend to not have a very clear lens as they look at what the world might think of their actions. I think we in the United States, in candor, sometimes have a blind spot in this regard. And I think that we think, gee, we're doing the right thing, it must be obvious to everyone that we're doing the right thing. We're sometimes surprised to learn that not everyone agrees with our sense of what the right thing is. And that's because our coloration of that lens is different because we're exceptional. And it's true for other countries as well. The other point I would make is, in the case of divine exceptionalism, you think that God is on your side. You think it's kind of, therefore, a matter of destiny, if you will, that your will be done. Because after all, if you're on God's side, how can you be wrong? And so it's the idea of, we can't lose. That's what you think if you're self-definingly divinely exceptional. If, on the other hand, you're an excluded exceptional, then what you think is a different thing. You think, what do we have to lose? Who cares? If we're already at the kids' table, if we're already outside of the community of the global community, the community of civilized nations, then what the heck difference does it make if we do nuclear tests, as North Korea has done repeatedly? We're already sanctioned every which way. We're already on the outside looking in. We're already not getting trade. We're already barely subsisting. Who cares at this point? We'll do anything we want to. If you have nothing to lose, that's a very dangerous place to be from the standpoint of world affairs. So, and finally, the thing I would say is, if you're in the case of a non-democracy, what I use a phrase called NDEA, or non-direct electoral accountability. I use that particular odd-sounding phrase to avoid the term democracy as I talk about this usually, because I don't want it to sound like I'm making any moralistic judgments for purposes of this discussion about non-democracies. I'm not saying that they're better or worse for purposes here. But when you don't have direct electoral accountability, you lack one of the main constraints to going into armed conflict, as a general rule. There are some exceptions to that, but as a rule, it's another layer of a kind of protective encasing that tends to preclude countries from going into conflict. If you happen to be a non-democracy, you're not constrained by the electorate, you're not constrained by the voting public, and you probably are most concerned about regime stability and continuity, and that may lead you to a different set of calculations. I will skip over here for purposes of brevity, or to put it more accurately, so I leave at least a few minutes left for Q&A, because I haven't been brief, and I apologize for that. But let me skip over the case studies. But I would just say, as one sentence summary of that, if you look at the world and see where the potential conflicts are in the world, then I think you can apply these ideas and see that what we're seeing in the world today is, in my judgment, at present, consistent with the theory that I've laid out. That there is no, partly because of how I designed my research effort, and I said, where are the conflicts, where are the potential conflicts, where are the lack of conflicts, and let me look at common denominators. Because I approached it that way, there is not currently a case that contradicts my theory. Now, that may sound tautological, but my theory is also forward-looking, and I would posit, again, that the universe of potential major international conflicts is actually much smaller than we think. And just to illustrate that point one last time before concluding, Bolivia will never fight a war with Vietnam, and Madagascar will never fight a war with Canada. And as you start to put the 193 nations of the world, their UN members, on an XY grid, what you quickly realize is the overwhelming majority, way into the above the 90th percentile, are conflicts that will never happen. They cannot, they will never happen, for reasons of geography or other reasons. At a minimum for those reasons, and for others as well. The known universe of probable conflicts is very limited. Now, final point, what does all this mean potentially for policymakers? Let me just say a couple of quick words and then I'll stop. I think it gives policymakers an alternative lens to look at the world today and to make judgments about where the conflicts are likely to occur and where they're not likely to occur. Should we be planning for a US-Russia conflict? I don't mean that, I mean that as a rhetorical question, but also kind of a real question. Should our defense planners be planning for that? Should we be planning for a US-China conflict? Or, on the contrary, should we be planning more likely for, let's say, a mainland Taiwan conflict? By the way, mainland Taiwan, that particular duo, meets all of my 5 criteria. You have one state, you have a non-democracy, or an entity, one of the 2 entities in which there's no direct electoral accountability. You have a non-nuclear power on one side of the strait. You have both parties feeling they're exceptional, and you have core psyche level identity interests at play on both sides, as well as existential interests. So do I think the US and Russia are going to get into war? Not nearly as likely as a scenario based on this theory of, for example, mainland China and Taiwan. That's not the only case. But it illustrates that if you apply this lens, you start to see the world slightly differently. So I think this theory can potentially be recognizing that it is a work in progress, it is not proven, it will only be proven or disproven over time. It may fall into, as the Chinese like to say, the trash heap of history if everything proves that I'm wrong. That has not happened yet, could very well happen. But until that time, it could be an alternative way of looking at the world and saying, what does this mean for defense resource allocation? So let me conclude then by simply saying this. Let me lay out as my final statement what I call the X factor theory, but less modestly what I call the Firestein theory of international conflict, major international conflict. And let me just read it so that you kind of have in one fell swoop what I'm trying to say, and I'll stop. Okay, quote, in the 21st century, major international conflict will tend to occur between 2 or more parties when all of the following conditions are met. 1, at least one of the 2 or more parties is a state. 2, at least one is a non-democracy. 3, at least one is a non-nuclear power. 4, at least one self-regards as exceptional. And 5, at least one of the parties perceives the implication of a national or regime interest that is either existential or relating to the party's core sense of identity. Unquote. That's my theory. That summarizes what I've said. And that means that this theory, therefore, posits that major international conflicts will not occur between non-state actors only, between democracies, between nuclear weapon states, between non-exceptionals, which is the great majority of the world, 90%, and between states grappling with interests below the level of existential or identity interests. So I hope that you find it food for thought. I'm very humble about this because I know how easy, from the research I've done, to be proven wrong as this goes forward. But for now, I offer this as a way of thinking about conflict in the world, and I would greatly value your feedback, your comments, your, as they say in China, precious criticism. And let me conclude by saying, Will, thank you so much again for this very fine privilege to be with the Clements Center, to be with all of you, and above all, to all of you, thank you for the generous gift of your time today. Thank you.